All right, everybody give up a round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Well, today is September the 3rd, 2019, which means that it's exactly 80 years since World War II was declared. And I was a 4-year-old living in Britain at the time. Kelsey, I need the map.
The map, okay.
Please. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You can see how close to France we were, and the Germans had already overtaken this part. And the area I'm going to talk about is here. This is London, and we lived just south or east of London. So it was a heavily bombed area, very bombed indeed. Now, 1939, there were rumours of war, and we didn't know whether it was coming or not. And the government issued us with air raid shelters, these sort, which, sorry, is my voice being echoed back?
I turned this TV up so they can hear you in the back. So please just continue.
Oh, that's good. The young man with the camera is my son, my 5th child. There's another one younger than him. I was an only child, which was a good thing, really. Anyway, these are the Anderson shelters. And can we have another picture? You can see the shape of them. They issued us with 4 pieces shaped like this, and then straight pieces for the back and the front, about this size, and it was very small. We had a packing case put in that I slept in the packing case, and my father slept on top of it with his feet out of the door because it wasn't very big. Okay? The London Underground at that time, they put bunks and things because people who lived within the city couldn't put air raid shelters in their homes or their gardens. So the underground, and you can see they turned off the juice at a certain time and people laid on the tracks or between the tracks and were safe there. We'll come back to those. In 1938, as I say, they started giving us these Anderson air raid shelters. And I can remember before war was declared, seeing enemy aircraft going over. They were spotting planes, I think. I don't really know, but they had big black German crosses on the underside, and you could see that. That was before they put the swastika on. I wish I could read my own writing. Dear me. Gas masks were issued, and this is one for a baby. You can see you put the baby right inside, and it was sealed so that the gas couldn't get into it. My young cousin was about that baby age, and she shrieked the whole time we put her in it, and she shrieked even more when we took her out. The gas masks themselves looked like this. A bit later, we were given another piece that went on the front of them, and people were shown how to put them on. You held it up by the straps that went over the head, put your fingers on the inside and pulled it down, tucked your chin in first and then pulled it over your head and breathed. Breathing in was okay, breathing out it would go on your cheeks. But people learned how to do it. Okay, sweetie. Barrage balloons were something that filled the sky. You could see them for miles. They just stretched along. My mother quoted Wordsworth and daffodils, saying, "They stretch in never-ending line along the margin of the bay." And that's just what they did. They would go up a little bit higher than the bombers had to fly, so that the planes would get caught in the wires underneath them. They weren't supposed to hit the balloons, but they would get caught in the wires. Oh, these were a later air raid shelter that you had in your house. My grandfather had one, my aunts had one, and it was horrible having to sleep in those. How they managed, I never saw a two-bunk one like that. How they managed, I don't know. It must have been absolutely, I don't know, terrible. Very useful to have as a dining room table. And searchlights. I can remember one time during the Blitz, my father took me out to the corner of the house, and he held out his overcoat, and I stood underneath it and watching the raid going on, and I felt perfectly safe. I knew no harm could come to me under his coat. It was totally safe there. And we watched the searchlights going through the sky, backwards and forwards, and catching aircraft. And you saw them having a dogfight, as we called it, as they encircled each other. And the noise in an air raid was absolutely phenomenal. You'd have the Beaufort guns, boom, 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 and the machine guns, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and the bombs whistling down. They had special whistles in them that made them scream, boom, 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 wow, bang, pow. It was absolutely terrifying. But I never remember being afraid, thanks to my dear parents. It was strange. One evening, a bomb fell across the road from us. Next morning, we had a look, and there was the crater in the field, because we lived in a fairly rural area, and there was a field ahead of us. And there was this big crater, and I clambered down. I suppose it must have been about 40 feet across, but when you're only a little girl, it's a bit different, you know. So this crater was there, and the earth was all torn up, and it was terrible. And I went back and had a look at it that fall. And do you know, it was full of willow herb, the pink flower that grows quite tall, and it had just seeded itself there, and already nature was taking over and making it look a lot better. My mother and I used to go to the shelter every night. My father was home still, he hadn't been called up into the service. And night after night we'd go out to the shelter across the lawn and get down there, and she got so sick of it and she said, "I'm not going anymore, we're just not going." So we didn't go for about 10 days. And then one night she said, "I think we will go to the shelter today." So that evening they took me as a child, wrapped up in a nice big eiderdown, out across the garden into the shelter. And as my father was making sure we were okay, he turned round, and there was a line of incendiary bombs had dropped. And they called them a stick of bombs. And they dropped, there was one near the shelter, so he put that out, and one by the corner of the house, he put that out, down the driveway, and there was one in the road, he put that out. And when he turned round, he saw a light in the bedroom window, and he thought, he must have left the light on in the bedroom when we took the child out. So he went back and opened the door, and the flames flew up at him. The room was already on fire. And if we'd waited another few minutes, they would never have got me out of there alive because of the incendiary that had dropped there. That wasn't the only time when I was saved. My mother and I, after my father had gone in the army, my mother and I were alone there, and that was fine. We didn't mind at all, because we knew we were going to be saved. We knew that we were going to win. We knew that God had a commission in the British Army. We were quite sure of this, so he was going to save us. And we were going out, this siren had gone, so we were about to run out, and already the planes were coming over and dropping their bombs. So we got under the dining room table, which was the safest place to be. And we got under there. And we didn't have electric light, we had gas light. And once you've broken the gas mantle, you had no light. So anyway, there we were. A bomb fell very near, the vibration shook the house, and there was a mirror on the wall above the table, and it crashed down and shattered to 1,000,000 pieces, and the lights all went out and we couldn't see. So there we were, stuck, surrounded by broken glass. And my mother very carefully said her prayers, as she always did in a bad situation, put her fingers out onto the table and put her hand on a box of matches, which she didn't remember being there. So slowly she'd strike a match and we'd go as far as we could, moving the glass out of the way until we were clear of it and safe. So, she was very good like that, my mother. She was quite sure that we were going to be saved. And that's why I was never really afraid of anything, I think. Then I got old enough to go to school. But all the schools had been evacuated. There were no schools around for us. The local schools had all closed. Children had been taken away to a safe area. And when I say safe, I mean, you can see on the map there, north of London or way to the West Country. And it was fairly safe there. So I couldn't go to school. That was great, wasn't it? I didn't really want to. Anyway, in the next village, about 4 miles away, these two old ladies, and they were old too, they reminded me very much of the ladies in Arsenic and Old Lace, you know, those two dear old souls with their brother. That's how they lived. And they started the school, and they had 10 children in the morning and 10 in the afternoon. And I was one of the morning children, and my mother would walk us to school, myself and 3 other little girls who were left in the area too. So we'd walk, and it was, well, I seem to remember people saying it was 4 miles, but I can't believe that somehow. My mother walked there and walked back. Did she walk 8 miles every morning? I don't know. Anyway, we would go along quite happily, but sometimes we'd have trouble. And I can remember one day there was an enemy aircraft, just one single plane strafing anything that moved. And we had to go and lay in the ditch at the side of the road and lay there until the aircraft had gone away and it was safe to come out again. And then off we'd go and she'd take us to school. It was a bit trying, I must say. You brush yourself off when you get out of the ditch. So they were dear old ladies, and they did very well. They taught us the ABCs, not much else, you know. I never learned to read, and I didn't write very well, but that was okay. The trouble was that when I went to school, when they did reopen them, I was considered backward, slow, and one of the children who needed special ed because of it. And then, after a while, the Americans came. So that must have been sometime after Pearl Harbor, probably in 1942, I don't really remember. And the Americans were there. And I was a nicely brought up young lady, and I was not allowed to talk to these people because you never know what they were up to. The soldiers, the British soldiers, had an expression which I thought was great. They said of the Americans, they're overpaid, oversexed, and over here. I can remember one evening, there was an American army camp near us, and remember one evening walking to the post box with my mother, and an American soldier was coming the other way, and she said good evening to him, and he said good evening to her. And I thought the world was coming to an end, you know, she spoke to an American. Oh. Then, of course, there was the rationing we all had to put up with. We were allowed to have, I think, ½ an ounce of butter a week, which isn't very much, and about 4 ounces of margarine. And meat was rationed by the price of it, so you could buy scrag end quite easily, but the big cuts of meat you just didn't see, and you couldn't afford them because you didn't have enough coupons for them. It was a shame, but we didn't get anything. The children didn't have any candies, or very few candies, and their teeth were in excellent condition. It was surprising. As I say, my father was in the service, and he was enlisted, but they had enlisted men go in, and they could become officers if they went to officer training, which he did, and he later became a major, which was very nice. He thoroughly enjoyed his war. Anyway, things got worse for us, and my mother's sisters, she had 3 sisters with children, they decided they were going to leave the area and go north, way north into Yorkshire. And that's what they did. So my mother and I had to move in with my grandfather and look after him. So my mother put all our furniture in store and gave up the house in which we were living, which was rented. And we never had our own house again until after I was married, so which was a long time. But we just lived with my grandfather, and I can remember that we'd stand in the garden and count the planes, the British planes that were going out over Europe to bomb. And then we'd count them coming back, and we'd know how many we'd lost on that particular day. Then the aunts got fed up with it all, and one of my aunts said, "I'll come home if you'll come and live with me, Iris." So my mother said, okay. So we went and lived with her, which was okay. I can remember it being quite a happy time, although it wasn't our own home. Oh, before that, sorry, I got a little arrow and I didn't notice it. In June of 1944, the enemy started sending the first rockets, buzz bombs as they were called, or doodlebugs. And they would come over, and I can remember the first night very well. My mother and I were in the shelter alone, and the planes would come, or the rockets would come, and they had a different sound from an aeroplane. The engines rattled, and it made it sound as though the whole sky was being vibrated and rattled, and it was quite frightening. And then it stopped, and then there would be an explosion. But the aircraft guns, the anti-aircraft guns, fired at them and tried to bring them down, but they didn't. And my mother was saying, "Oh, we're getting all these aircraft, we're shooting them down," because she didn't know that when the engines stopped, they'd run out of fuel, and then they came down. They came every 15 minutes. We counted and we realized that's what was happening, and we realized too that it was something different. So after one had gone, we quickly ran into the house and got some food and some drink and took it back to the shelter where we stayed for the next one to come over. And I can remember how before that we stayed in the shelter, and it was just terrifying noises, and we decided to come out as soon as it got light and the sun came up, and we climbed out of the shelter to this beautiful spring day, and there were woods all around us, and they were green and lush and beautiful, and it was as though it was the beginning of the world. This noisy, terrible night that we'd been through, and then the dawn came, and we, as I say, rushed indoors and got food and drink and rushed out again before the next one came. Eventually, we were found by the local ARP warden. That was the Air Raid Protection Warden, or Air Raid Precaution Warden, I'm not sure. And he took us to a neighbour's house where we were able to rest and sleep for a while and get some food and so on. That was in June. Then, in September, the Germans had invented another little horror, the V2 rocket. And this was a rocket that, well, going back to the V1 rocket, they didn't have enough fuel in them that first night because they didn't know how much it would take, so there wasn't quite enough fuel, and it landed in our area. All the bombs that came over that night landed within about 20 miles of us, the ones that weren't actually there, you know. And then they sent over the V2 rocket, which didn't have a noise. It was a very high-powered one, much faster, so we didn't hear it coming, and it would just explode. Bang! Destroying all sorts of things, but we didn't worry about that because you didn't know it was coming anyway, so you couldn't run and hide. So if you were killed, and that was it. My parents had made a decision that if they were going to be killed, then I should go with them because they didn't want anybody else bringing me up. I was a ewe lamb who was much adored, and they weren't having anybody else taking care of me. Eventually the schools reopened, and we had air raid shelters in the playgrounds. They were built above ground, and